employer of Lloyd's TSB has had a letter saying we're going to make 40,000 of you redundant because of the merger taking place between Lloyd's TSB and HBOS, well, it's pretty clear. What takes place in the finance sector has an effect on the rest of us as well, as workers are losing their jobs. And here in the City of London, it's not just the people who work in the city, it's the people who clean for the people who work in the city, the people who give them coffee, the people who serve in the supermarkets that they shop in. All of that is going to be affected. But it's not just that. Britain is expected to have the worst recession of any of the G7 countries. That's the statistics of the OECD. The G7 are the biggest countries, biggest economies in the world. Manufacturing already has suffered the biggest drop in output over the last month since records began in the early 1990s. House prices, I just picked this up on the tube on the way here, so property prices fall off a cliff. There you are. That's what's taking place in house prices in Britain at the moment. They're expected to fall by something like 40% by the end of this year. Now, at the very beginning of this, I think there were a lot of young people who thought, oh, good, house prices will fall and then one day I'll be able to buy a house. Sadly, that isn't how it's working out, because the number of mortgages that were agreed has dropped by 95%. It's absolutely huge. And the days of being able to get a 100% mortgage or a 125% mortgage, like they were giving out 2 years ago, that is gone forever. Now young people have to save £20,000 before they stand any chance of getting a mortgage to buy a house. That means, by the way, the complete end of the dream or the myth of the home-owning democracy. Those of you who are old enough to remember the Tories and Maggie Thatcher, they bought in this idea, every British man and woman will own their own home and this will be a dream of wonderful democracy. And New Labour have completely carried on with it. For a younger generation now, that is ruled out forever. And it's no coincidence there are now 5 million people in Britain who want social housing, who want a council house or a housing association house if they can't get a council house. Of course, the problem is there are hardly any left. And what is left has been completely run down in terms of council housing by the government because they wanted to get rid of them. But that will lead to new movements for the idea of social housing. Unemployment is also expected to go up to about 2 million by Christmas. And of course that will have a further effect in cutting consumption, what people buy, because people aren't going to have the money to buy, which is already at a 16-year low. And just to put a tin hat on it, we've all experienced the increase in gas, electricity, food prices over the course of the last year. So the British economy is in a pretty bad way, one of the worst, and we're going to suffer for it. The world as a whole is going to suffer. There's a dream by some capitalist economists that maybe what are called the BRIC countries will rescue capitalism, and that's Brazil, Russia, India, and in particular China. The idea that these growing countries, the economies, will be able to rescue the world economy, but it's just ruled out. In China, which is the biggest of them, then the economy is still growing quite fast, but growth is expected to drop by about 4% to around 8% next year. And in terms of China, that will mean factories shutting, workers being kicked out, and that's already taking place actually in China at the moment. And the reason's fairly simple. It's because the Chinese population cannot afford to buy the goods that they're making. In the main, it was the US population, the British population, the European population that were buying this stuff. So if there's a recession here, then there's no way that a growing Chinese middle class will be able to compensate for that. And in fact, the consumption in China is lower now than it was 10 years ago, according to the latest figures. Just one aside on that. There'll be many people probably tonight plugging this event when you'll get a chance to find out a lot more about Marxism and socialism than we can possibly pack into this meeting tonight. It's a whole weekend of discussion and debate on socialist ideas. But we've just had confirmed today that we're going to be able to have a Chinese activist who's beginning to build forces of Trotskyism, of socialism in China, who will be able to come and address that rally on the Saturday night as well as to speak at the session. So that's definitely kind of an added incentive on the struggle of the Chinese working class, which is going to develop massively in the coming years to come along to that. So I think it's not necessary to say here that Gordon Brown's idea of boom and bust being gone forever was always a load of old nonsense, and we're now experiencing that. Of course, it's not the end of capitalism. However bad this crisis is, capitalism is not going to spontaneously collapse. On the contrary, the capitalists will try and get out of it. And the way they will do it is by making working class people pay for the crisis. It's estimated in the City of London that their bonuses are going to go down from £8 billion a year to £5 billion a year. Well, what a terrible shame, you know. They may suffer a little bit, but they're going to make sure that it's us that suffer in the main for the crisis. Nonetheless, while it won't mean an end of capitalism in itself, it is going to lead to the rebuilding of mass support for socialist and for Marxist ideas. And that's against the background of the last 20 years, because socialist ideas have been unusually marginalised over the course of the last 20 years. At the time when the regimes that existed in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe collapsed, which again is, I know, before some of you were born, they weren't, in our opinion, genuine socialism. They were horrific dictatorships. But nonetheless, when they collapsed, that was a big triumph for capitalism. The Wall Street Journal actually had a front page which says, "We've won." And they had the idea that capitalism was going to dominate the world, it was going to bring democracy to everybody, and we warned that that wouldn't be the case. But it's now, only 20 years later, that that has kind of been fully shown in terms of, in the most favourable possible conditions for them, the mess that the capitalist system has made for millions of people around the world. And so the ideas of Karl Marx are going to come back onto the agenda. If you haven't already done so, I'd recommend to all of you that you read this little pamphlet, which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels first published 160 years ago. It's the anniversary this year, as a kind of introduction to the ideas of Karl Marx. But actually there's a lot more even than is packed into this little pamphlet. And even though he was writing, they were writing, long before the city existed in the way that it does today, long before computers and all the things that enable them to pass vast amounts of money in seconds around the world, before futures and all the other gambling instruments that they've had over the last 10 years. Nonetheless, he predicted the role that credit will play in a capitalist economy, and he was very prescient on those issues. He said that capitalism was a necessary lubricant, that credit was a necessary lubricant to the capitalist system. But he also said that it brought in its wake a bunch of swindlers and thieves. Well, we can all see that that's the case. He said you could use it to prolong growth, and that's what the capitalists use it for, and that's what they've done. In Britain, we've had economic growth, formally speaking, for 16 years. But he also said it's like a piece of elastic. You can pull and pull and pull, but the further you pull it, the harder it snaps back and the worse that the crisis is. And that is what has happened. The fact that they've kept the economy growing for 16 years during credit now means that the hangover is all the worse. And he also said, to paraphrase, that everything's fantastic until it isn't. And that's pretty much what's happened in the economy. It was all going to be wonderful forever. There was only very few people like ourselves who saw how it was going to go wrong. And then, from one day to the next, the capitalists go from saying it's all going to be fantastic to saying we're doomed, which is basically their position.